I learned 3 things about Deborah Fitzgerald the day she seized my workshop. She didn't read property surveys, she didn't understand federal law, and she definitely didn't expect someone with my background to fight back. The morning started normal enough. I was in my detached workshop behind my house in Henderson, Nevada, finishing up a custom knife I'd been working on for weeks. The smell of metal and oil filled the air as I carefully ground the edge to perfection. Retirement had been good to me. After 32 years as a United States Marshal, I'd earned the right to spend my days doing what I loved in my own space on my own property. My name is Warren Quincy, and I'd spent 3 decades tracking down fugitives, protecting witnesses, and serving federal warrants. I'd testified in more courtrooms than I could count and documented everything with the precision that comes from years of building cases that had to hold up under scrutiny. Those habits don't just disappear when you turn in your badge. The workshop sat on a portion of my 2-acre lot that extended beyond the main residential area of Sage Creek Estates. When I bought the property 5 years ago, I'd specifically chosen it because the previous owner had already built the workshop on a corner that jutted out slightly from the standard subdivision lots. The survey was crystal clear. Every inch of that workshop sat on my property, a good 15 feet inside my boundary line. I heard the voices before I saw them, loud, entitled voices that made my jaw tighten. I set down my tools and walked to the workshop door, wiping my hands on a rag. Deborah Fitzgerald stood in my driveway with 3 men I didn't recognize. She was exactly what you'd picture, blonde highlights that looked like they cost more than my monthly electric bill, yoga pants despite never having seen the inside of a gym, and that particular expression of self-righteous fury that comes from too many years running an HOA unchecked. "This structure is in violation of community standards," she announced, not to me but to the men beside her. One held a clipboard, the other 2 wore work clothes. "It needs to be removed immediately." "Excuse me?" I stepped out of the workshop. "That's my property you're talking about." Deborah turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Quincy, I've sent you 3 notices about this eyesore. Since you've failed to respond, the HOA board has voted to take action." I responded to every single notice. I sent certified letters explaining that this workshop is on my property within code and predates any HOA architectural guidelines. She waved her hand dismissively. "The HOA has jurisdiction over all structures visible from community areas. This workshop violates our aesthetic standards. You have 24 hours to remove it, or we'll do it for you and bill you for the costs." I felt the old Marshal instincts kick in. Stay calm, document everything, let them talk. People always revealed more when they thought they had the upper hand. "You can't do that. This is private property." "Actually, Mr. Quincy, when you purchased your home, you signed the HOA covenant. That gives us certain rights. Now, I've been patient, but my patience has limits." She turned back to the men. "Make note of all the equipment inside. We'll need a full inventory for the lien." My blood pressure spiked, but I kept my voice level. "You're not inventorying anything. Get off my property." Deborah's smile turned icy. "We have every right to be here. I suggest you cooperate, or this will become much more expensive for you." She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of my workshop. I went back inside and immediately called my attorney, Marcus Chen, who I'd worked with on several federal cases back in the day. His firm now did private practice, and he owed me a few favors. "Warren, slow down," Marcus said after I'd explained the situation. "She can't just seize your property. HOAs have authority over covenant violations, but they need to follow legal procedures. Did you get the notices in writing?" "Yes, and I responded to all of them. I've got copies of everything." "Good. Keep documenting. If they try anything, it's trespassing and theft. I'll send them a cease and desist letter today." But Deborah Fitzgerald wasn't the type to wait for lawyers. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of a truck backing into my driveway. I threw on clothes and ran outside to find a moving crew already working on my workshop. The padlock I'd installed had been cut, and men were loading my tools into a truck. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted. A thin man with a clipboard stepped forward. "We're contracted by Sage Creek Estates HOA to remove property in violation of community standards." "This is theft. I'm calling the police right now." "We have authorization." He showed me a document with Deborah's signature and the HOA seal. If you interfere, you'll be in violation of the HOA agreement. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, but the Henderson Police Department wasn't particularly helpful. The officer who showed up listened to both sides and basically shrugged. "This sounds like a civil matter, sir. If you have a dispute with your HOA, you need to take it up in court." "They're stealing my property," I said, trying to keep my frustration in check. "They have paperwork saying they have authority. I can't arrest someone for a contract dispute." The officer was young, probably didn't even remember when I'd worked joint operations with local law enforcement. "You need to get a lawyer." I watched, helpless and furious, as they loaded up $20,000 worth of tools, equipment, and materials. Bandsaw, drill press, lathe, welding equipment, hand tools I'd collected over decades, everything that made that workshop functional. Deborah appeared around noon, watching the final items get loaded with obvious satisfaction. "You could have avoided this, Mr. Quincy," she said. "All you had to do was comply with community standards." "I'll see you in court," I said quietly. "You'll lose. The HOA covenant is very clear about our authority." She held up her phone. "And by the way, we're auctioning your tools this weekend to cover the removal costs and fines. You currently owe the HOA $17,000 in violations and fees." Something in my expression must have alarmed her because she took a step back. I'd spent 32 years hunting dangerous people, and I knew how to project that energy when needed. "You've made a serious mistake," I said, "and I'm going to prove it." She laughed, but it sounded nervous. "Enjoy your lawsuit, Mr. Quincy. The HOA has an excellent legal team." After she left, I went back inside and did what I'd done for 3 decades. I built a case. First, I pulled out my property survey. I'd had it done professionally when I bought the house, and I'd had it certified again 3 years ago when I'd added some landscaping. The workshop was clearly, unambiguously on my property. Every measurement, every boundary marker, every legal description confirmed it. Second, I reviewed every piece of correspondence with the HOA. I'd kept copies of everything: their notices, my responses, certified mail receipts, emails. I'd specifically cited the property survey and Nevada state law regarding HOA authority in each response. Third, I started digging into the HOA itself. Public records are wonderful things when you know how to access them. I pulled the original HOA covenant from when Sage Creek Estates was developed. I got the meeting minutes from the county clerk's office. I looked up every board member's background. And that's when things got interesting. The HOA covenant had specific limitations on its authority. It could regulate exterior paint colors, landscaping in front yards, and structures visible from the street. But it explicitly stated that detached workshops on lots larger than 1 acre fell outside architectural review if they weren't visible from primary streets. My workshop sat behind my house, screened by trees on a 2-acre lot. It wasn't visible from any public street. More interesting, Deborah Fitzgerald had been on the HOA board for 8 years, and in that time, the HOA had filed liens against 17 different homeowners. Every single one had eventually paid rather than fight it in court. The HOA had collected over $400,000 in the past 5 years from fines, fees, and voluntary settlements. I called Marcus back. "I need you to file an emergency motion. They're auctioning my property this weekend." "I'm already on it. I've got the cease and desist drafted, and we're filing for an immediate injunction. But Warren, I need to be honest. Even if we win the injunction, this is going to be expensive. HOA cases can drag on for years." "I don't care about expensive. I care about right and wrong." "I know. That's why we worked well together. I'll have the papers filed by end of day." But Deborah moved faster. The auction was scheduled for Saturday morning, and Marcus couldn't get a hearing before Monday. I drove to the storage facility where they'd taken my tools on Friday afternoon. A large banner advertised estate sale, quality tools, and equipment. I took pictures of everything: the banner, the facility, the lock on the unit. Then I went inside the facility office. "I need to speak to the manager," I told the teenager at the desk. "He's not here right now." "Then call him. Tell him Warren Quincy is here about the property in Unit 42, and if he doesn't want to be named as a defendant in a federal lawsuit, he should get here fast." The kid's eyes widened. He made the call. The manager, a nervous man named Dale, showed up 20 minutes later. I handed him a copy of my property survey, the HOA covenant, and Marcus's legal letterhead explaining that the seizure was illegal. "This auction can't happen," I said. "That's stolen property, and if you facilitate its sale, you're liable." Dale sweated through his shirt reading the documents. The HOA said they had legal authority. The HOA lied. You're a neutral third party, which means you need to verify ownership before selling goods. Did you check the property titles? Did you verify their claim? I mean, they're the HOA. I assumption isn't due diligence. If you proceed with this auction, I'll make sure you're personally named in the lawsuit, along with your company. Dale canceled the auction. Deborah called me that evening, absolutely livid. "You had no right to interfere with HOA business?" "I had every right to prevent the theft of my property. See you in court, Deborah." "This isn't over. The HOA board is meeting tomorrow and we're filing formal complaints against you for harassment and threatening behavior." "Document everything," I said. "I certainly am." Marcus got us a hearing the following Tuesday. It was just a preliminary injunction hearing, but it would determine whether the HOA had to return my property immediately or if it could stay in storage while the case proceeded. I showed up at the Clark County Courthouse at 8 in the morning wearing my best suit. Marcus was already there, reviewing notes. "Their lawyer's Gerald Hutchinson. He does a lot of HOA work, bit of a bulldog." "I've dealt with worse," I said, thinking of defense attorneys who'd tried to tear apart my testimony in federal cases. Deborah arrived with Gerald and 2 other board members, a thin man named Richard Pemberton and a woman named Susan Chen, no relation to Marcus. They all had that same entitled confidence. Judge Patricia Morales called the hearing to order. She was in her 50s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "This is a preliminary hearing on the plaintiff's motion for an emergency injunction," she said. "Mr. Chen, you're representing the plaintiff." Marcus stood. "Yes, Your Honor. Warren Quincy is seeking the immediate return of his property, which was illegally seized by the Sage Creek Estates HOA. Gerald stood as well. "Your Honor, the HOA acted within its authority under the covenant agreement. Mr. Quincy was notified multiple times of violations and refused to comply." "Let's start with the basic facts," Judge Morales said. "Mr. Chen, what's your client's position?" Marcus laid it out clearly. "Your Honor, the HOA claims Mr. Quincy's workshop violates community standards. However, the workshop sits entirely on Mr. Quincy's property, is not visible from public streets, and falls outside the HOA's jurisdiction according to their own covenant. Mr. Quincy responded to every notice explaining this, but the HOA ignored him and seized his property anyway." "Do you have the property survey?" the judge asked. Marcus handed over certified copies. "Yes, Your Honor. This survey clearly shows the workshop is 15 feet inside Mr. Quincy's property line. We've also provided the original HOA covenant, which explicitly exempts detached workshops on lots over 1 acre from architectural review if they're not street visible." Gerald jumped in. "Your Honor, the covenant gives the HOA broad authority to maintain community standards. The board determined that Mr. Quincy's workshop was an eyesore that affected property values." "Counselor," Judge Morales said, "I'm reading this covenant and it seems pretty specific about the limitations on HOA authority. Can you show me where the HOA has authority over non-street visible structures on large lots?" Gerald flipped through his papers. "The general provisions in Section 3 state that the HOA can regulate any structure that impacts community aesthetics. But Section 7 specifically carves out exceptions." "Das," Marcus countered. "And Mr. Quincy's workshop falls squarely within those exceptions." Judge Morales looked at me. "Mr. Quincy, did you respond to the HOA's notices?" I stood. "Yes, Your Honor. I responded to every single notice in writing, with copies of the property survey and relevant sections of the covenant. I explained that their claim had no legal basis." "And the HOA's response?" "They ignored everything and seized my property anyway." "Your Honor," Gerald said, "Mr. Quincy has been hostile and uncooperative throughout this process." "I have copies of all my correspondence," I said. "I was professional in every communication. They're the ones who broke into my workshop and stole $20,000 worth of tools." "Mr. Quincy," the judge said, "I understand you're upset, but let's keep this factual." "Those are the facts, Your Honor. They cut my lock and removed my property without a court order. In my career, we called that theft. Judge Morales raised an eyebrow. Your career? I'm a retired United States Marshal, 32 years of service. Something shifted in the judge's expression. I see. And I assume you documented everything? Extensively, Your Honor. Marcus handed up a thick binder. Your Honor, we've compiled all correspondence, photographs of the seizure, the property survey, and the relevant sections of Nevada state law regarding HOA authority. We've also included documentation showing that the HOA has a pattern of making aggressive enforcement actions that exceed their legal authority. Gerald's face reddened. Your Honor, that's completely irrelevant to this case. Actually, Marcus said, it goes to show a pattern of behavior. The HOA has filed liens against 17 homeowners in the past 8 years, collecting over $400,000 in fines and fees. How is that relevant? Gerald demanded. Because in 12 of those cases, the homeowners paid despite having valid defenses. The HOA uses aggressive tactics to coerce payment rather than following proper legal procedures. Judge Morales flipped through the binder. This is quite thorough. Mr. Hutchinson, do you have evidence that the workshop actually violates the covenant? The board made a determination based on community standards. That's not what I asked. Show me the specific covenant provision that gives the board authority over Mr. Quincy's workshop. Gerald struggled. He kept citing general provisions about community aesthetics, but Judge Morales kept pushing him back to the specific language about exceptions. Finally, she set down the papers. I've seen enough. Mr. Hutchinson, your client's position is not supported by their own covenant. Mr. Quincy's workshop clearly falls within the exception for large lots and non-street visible structures. Furthermore, the HOA's seizure of Mr. Quincy's property without a court order appears to be a clear violation of Nevada property law. Your Honor, the HOA acted in good faith, Gerald protested. Good faith doesn't override property rights. Here's my ruling. The HOA will immediately return all of Mr. Quincy's property to his possession in the same condition it was removed. All fines and fees assessed against Mr. Quincy are vacated. The HOA is enjoined from any further enforcement actions regarding the workshop. If the HOA believes they have a valid claim, they can file a proper lawsuit, but they will not engage in self-help remedies. I felt a surge of satisfaction, but Judge Morales wasn't done. Furthermore, I'm concerned about the HOA's pattern of behavior. Mr. Chen, I suggest your client consider whether there are grounds for a countersuit. The seizure of property without legal authority could constitute conversion and possibly other claims. We're considering all options, Your Honor. Deborah looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. Gerald tried to argue, but the judge cut him off. My ruling stands. Mr. Hutchinson, your client will return Mr. Quincy's property by end of business tomorrow, or they'll be in contempt. We're adjourned. Outside the courthouse, Deborah confronted me with Gerald trying to pull her back. This isn't over, she hissed. The board will appeal. We'll fight this at every level. Go ahead, I said calmly. Every time you fight it, you'll lose, and it'll cost your HOA more money. Money that comes from your neighbor's dues. Eventually, they're going to wonder why you're wasting their money on a crusade you can't win. You think you're so smart because you were some federal cop. This is my community, and I decide what's acceptable. Marcus stepped forward. Mrs. Fitzgerald, I'd advise you to stop talking. Anything you say now can be used against you in the countersuit we're filing. Her eyes widened. Countersuit? For conversion, trespass, violation of property rights, and possibly fraud if we can prove you knowingly exceeded your authority. We're going to depose every board member and review every HOA action for the past 8 years. If there's anything improper, we'll find it. Gerald pulled her away, whispering urgently. The three of them left quickly. That felt good, I admitted to Marcus. It gets better. Start thinking about damages, not just the cost of your tools, but the value of your time, emotional distress, and possibly punitive damages if we can prove malicious intent. My tools were returned the next day, though several items were damaged. The bandsaw's table was cracked, and several hand tools were missing. I documented everything with photographs and detailed notes, just like I'd done at crime scenes for 30 years. But I wasn't done investigating. If I was going to file a countersuit, I wanted to know exactly who I was dealing with. I started with public records. HOA meeting minutes were supposed to be available to all homeowners, but when I requested them, I got stonewalled. Deborah claimed they were under review and couldn't be released. That was a red flag. Nevada's Common Interest Ownership Act was specific about homeowner rights to HOA records. The HOA had 10 days to provide them. When they didn't, Marcus filed a motion to compel. While waiting for that, I talked to neighbors. I'd mostly kept to myself since moving to Sage Creek Estates, focusing on my workshop projects. That was a mistake. I'd missed a lot of community dynamics. My neighbor to the east, an older woman named Helen Garcia, was happy to talk. "Deborah's been running this HOA like her personal fiefdom for years," Helen said over coffee on her back patio. "She's fined people for having the wrong shade of beige on their trim. She tried to make us remove our vegetable garden because it wasn't aesthetically pleasing. We fought it and won, but it cost us $3,000 in legal fees." "Why doesn't anyone vote her out?" Helen laughed bitterly. "She controls the voting. Only about 20% of homeowners show up to meetings, and Deborah's got a core group of friends who support everything she does. The rest of us are too busy or too tired to fight." "Has anyone looked into the HOA's finances?" "We've asked, but the financial reports are always vague. Administrative costs and legal fees and maintenance reserves. Nothing specific." That evening, I called an old friend from my Marshal days. Frank Delgado had retired a few years before me and now did private investigation work. "Warren, Quincy," Frank said warmly. "I heard you retired to Nevada. How's civilian life?" "Complicated. I need a favor. Background checks on some people, and I need to know if there's anything off about an HOA's finances." "HOA trouble? Man, those can be worse than fugitive cases. At least with fugitives, you know they're criminals. HOAs think they're righteous." I gave him the names: Deborah Fitzgerald, Richard Pemberton, Susan Chen, and the HOA's management company, Pinnacle Property Services. "I want to know everything: criminal records, civil judgments, financial problems, anything that might explain why they're so aggressive about enforcement." Frank called back 3 days later. "Warren, you've got a mess here. Deborah Fitzgerald has no criminal record, but she's been named in 5 civil suits in the past 10 years. 3 are HOA-related, settled out of court. The other 2 are interesting. One's a small claims suit from a contractor who claimed she refused to pay for completed work. The other's a business dispute with a former partner." "What kind of business?" "Property management. She ran a small company that managed rental properties. It folded 6 years ago, right around when she joined the Sage Creek Estates Board. The lawsuit claimed she misappropriated funds from maintenance reserves." "That was very interesting. What about the others?" "Richard Pemberton is clean. Retired accountant, no issues. Susan Chen is a lawyer, ironically. Corporate law, not HOA stuff, but she should know better than to go along with illegal seizures." "And Pinnacle Property Services?" "Now that's where it gets good. Pinnacle is owned by a guy named Trevor Masterson. He's been investigated twice by the Nevada Real Estate Division for improper handling of HOA funds. No charges filed, but there were complaints. He's also connected to 3 other HOAs that have had major financial irregularities." "Connected how?" "His company manages them. In 2 cases, board members were found to be receiving kickbacks from vendors that the management company recommended. One board president went to jail." I felt that old familiar tingle, the one I got when a case was about to break open. "Can you get me details on those cases?" "Already compiling them. Warren, if there's financial funny business going on, you might want to bring in the authorities. This could be bigger than a property dispute." Marcus finally got the court order compelling the HOA to release their records. When they arrived, I spent 3 days going through them with the detailed attention I'd once reserved for tracking fugitive financial trails. The HOA collected about $40,000 a month in dues from the 200 homes in Sage Creek Estates. That was almost $500,000 a year. Operating expenses for a community this size should be around 60% of that, leaving a healthy reserve fund. But the reserves were barely $100,000, and they'd been that low for years. Where was the money going? Administrative fees to Pinnacle Property Services, $15,000 a month. That was way above market rate for a community this size. Legal fees, averaging $5,000 a month, paid to Gerald Hutchinson's firm. That seemed high unless they were constantly in litigation. Maintenance contracts, landscaping, pool service, common area upkeep. The amounts weren't outrageous, but when I looked up the vendors, several had interesting connections. Green Horizons Landscaping was owned by Trevor Masterson's brother-in-law. Desert Pool Services listed Deborah Fitzgerald as a silent partner in their LLC filing. It was a classic scheme. The HOA board approved contracts with vendors they had financial interests in, paid above market rates, and pocketed the difference. The aggressive enforcement actions generated additional revenue through fines and fees, which also flowed through the same system. I compiled everything into a detailed report and sent it to Marcus. He called me within an hour. "Warren, this is potential fraud. We need to report this to the Nevada Attorney General's office." "I want to be sure first. Can we get a forensic accountant to review the records?" "Absolutely. I know someone who does this kind of work." "But Warren, if this is what it looks like, we're talking about potential criminal charges. Are you prepared for that?" "I spent 32 years building criminal cases. I'm very prepared." Marcus brought in a forensic accountant named Patricia Reynolds. She spent a week analyzing the HOA's financial records and came back with a detailed report that was even more damning than I'd expected. That is her. "This HOA has diverted approximately $250,000 over the past 5 years, Patricia explained in Marcus's office. "The scheme is relatively simple. Inflated service contracts with connected vendors, excessive administrative fees to a management company that provides minimal services, and legal fees for unnecessary enforcement actions. The board members are receiving kickbacks, though they've tried to hide it through shell companies and family members." "Can you prove it?" I asked. "With subpoena power, absolutely. The paper trail is there, it's just obscured. Bank records for the shell companies will show payments flowing back to the board members." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "This is wire fraud. Potentially RICO if we can show it's an ongoing criminal enterprise. Warren, you need to decide how far you want to take this." I thought about Helen Garcia and the $3,000 she'd spent fighting a bogus complaint about her vegetable garden. I thought about the 17 homeowners who'd paid fines rather than fight. I thought about Deborah Fitzgerald's smug expression when she'd watched my tools being loaded into that truck. "All the way," I said. "These people have been stealing from their neighbors for years. That doesn't stand." Marcus contacted the Nevada Attorney General's office and the FBI's white-collar crime division. Given my background, they took the complaint seriously and assigned investigators immediately. But I'd learned a long time ago that investigations take time, and I wanted some immediate satisfaction. Marcus filed our countersuit: conversion, trespass, violation of property rights, fraud, and civil RICO allegations. We were asking for return of my property, already done, compensation for damages, about $5,000 for damaged tools, and punitive damages of $500,000. Gerald Hutchinson tried to get the suit dismissed, arguing that the HOA had acted in good faith based on their interpretation of the covenant. Judge Morales, who was assigned to the case, was not sympathetic. "Counselor, we already established that the HOA exceeded its authority. Now Mr. Quincy is alleging that this was part of a pattern of fraudulent behavior. These are serious allegations with substantial evidence. We're going to trial." The trial was set for 8 months out, which gave the criminal investigators time to build their case. In the meantime, word spread through Sage Creek Estates about what was happening. Helen Garcia started a homeowner group to recall the board. Within a week, they had signatures from over 60% of residents. The recall election was scheduled for 2 months out. Deborah fought it desperately. She sent letters to every homeowner claiming that I was a troublemaker who was trying to destroy the community. She held a meeting where she warned that removing the board would lead to chaos and declining property values. But people had started asking questions. Once the lawsuit became public, other homeowners came forward with their own stories. A man named James Brennan had paid $12,000 in fines for adding a deck that the board claimed violated setback requirements, even though his survey showed it was compliant. A couple named the Rodriguezes had been fined $8,000 for unauthorized exterior modifications when they'd painted their front door a slightly different shade of approved beige. The recall election was bitter. Deborah's supporters claimed that she was protecting property values and that people like me were trying to turn Sage Creek Estates into a slum. Helen and her group pointed to the financial irregularities and the pattern of excessive enforcement. The board was recalled by a 73% vote. Deborah's supporters lost badly. A new board was elected, including Helen Garcia as president. One of their first acts was to hire a new management company and terminate the relationship with Pinnacle Property Services. The second was to cooperate fully with the criminal investigation. With access to all the HOA records and the cooperation of the new board, the FBI and Attorney General's office moved quickly. They subpoenaed bank records for Deborah Fitzgerald, Trevor Masterson, and the various vendor companies. The financial trail was exactly what Patricia Reynolds had predicted. Deborah had received approximately $60,000 in kickbacks over 5 years. Trevor Masterson had taken about $90,000 through inflated management fees. Richard Pemberton, the retired accountant, had gotten $40,000 for keeping the books clean and obscure. Even Susan Chen had received $15,000, though her lawyer status might have made her too nervous to take more. 6 months after I'd watched my tools get loaded onto that truck, federal and state agents arrested all 4 of them. The charges were wire fraud, mail fraud, theft, and conspiracy. Gerald Hutchinson was named as an unindicted co-conspirator, though they didn't have enough evidence to charge him directly. His law license was under review by the Nevada State Bar. The news coverage was significant. HOA, board members arrested in fraud scheme, ran in the Las Vegas Review-Journal. Local TV stations did segments about HOA fraud and homeowner rights. I gave a couple of interviews, explaining how I'd discovered the scheme and emphasizing that homeowners needed to pay attention to their HOA finances. Deborah's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutors weren't interested. This case was going to send a message about HOA fraud in Nevada. The criminal trial started 9 months after the initial incident. I attended every day, sitting in the back of the courtroom and watching the prosecution methodically build their case. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showing transfers from vendor companies to accounts controlled by the defendants. Emails discussing how to structure contracts to hide the kickbacks. Trevor Masterson's ex-wife testified that he'd bragged about milking HOAs as a business model. The defense tried to argue that the fees were legitimate business expenses and that the board members had done nothing wrong. But when the prosecution showed that Deborah Fitzgerald had received payments from Green Horizons Landscaping while voting to approve their inflated contracts, the jury's expressions said everything. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, guilty on all counts. Deborah Fitzgerald looked like she'd been hit by a truck when the verdict was read. Trevor Masterson stared at the table. Richard Pemberton cried. Susan Chen sat motionless, her legal career evaporating in front of her. Sentencing came 2 months later. Judge Harold Chen, no relation to Susan or Marcus, was a no-nonsense former prosecutor who'd built his career on white-collar crime cases. The defendants in this case violated the trust of their community, Judge Chen said. They were elected to protect their neighbors' interests, and instead they used their positions to steal. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was calculated, ongoing theft from people who trusted them. Deborah Fitzgerald, 4 years in federal prison, restitution of $60,000 and a $50,000 fine. Trevor Masterson, 5 years in federal prison, restitution of $90,000 and a $100,000 fine. Richard Pemberton, 3 years in federal prison, restitution of $40,000 and a $30,000 fine. Susan Chen, 2 years in federal prison, restitution of $15,000, disbarment, and a $20,000 fine. My civil case settled a week after sentencing. The HOA's insurance company paid $200,000 to settle all claims. The new board issued a formal apology and amended the covenant to clarify the limitations on HOA authority and require annual financial audits by independent accountants. I used part of the settlement money to upgrade my workshop. New bandsaw, better lathe, professional-grade welding equipment. The rest went into a legal defense fund that Helen Garcia's group established to help homeowners fight unjust HOA actions. The day after the settlement was finalized, I was back in my workshop, working on a knife commission. The smell of metal and oil, the satisfaction of creating something with my hands, the peace of working on my own property without someone trying to take it away. Helen stopped by that afternoon with a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses. "We're having a community celebration this weekend," she said. "Everyone wants to thank you for standing up to Deborah." "I just wanted my tools back," I said, though we both knew it had become bigger than that. "You could have taken the settlement after the judge ordered your property returned. You didn't have to pursue the criminal case." "Yes, I did. People like Deborah count on everyone being too tired or too scared to fight back. Someone had to show that there are consequences." Helen poured 2 generous glasses. "To property rights and federal marshals who know how to document everything." We drank as the sun set over the Nevada desert, painting my workshop in golden light. Somewhere, Deborah Fitzgerald was preparing for federal prison, and Trevor Masterson was probably wondering how his scheme had unraveled so completely. The answer was simple. They'd picked the wrong target. They'd assumed I was just another homeowner who would pay up rather than fight. They hadn't counted on someone who'd spent 32 years building cases, who knew how to follow paper trails, and who understood that documentation and persistence always win in the end. 3 months later, I got a call from a homeowner in Carson City. His HOA was trying to seize his garage for alleged code violations, and he'd heard about my case. Did I have any advice? I spent 2 hours on the phone walking him through the process. Document everything, get a property survey, review the covenant language, check the HOA's legal authority. I connected him with Marcus and gave him Patricia Reynolds' contact information. The word spread. I started getting calls from homeowners across Nevada, then from other states, people who were being bullied by their HOAs and didn't know how to fight back. I couldn't help everyone personally, but I compiled a guide. Homeowner Rights: How to Fight HOA Overreach. It covered documentation, legal procedures, how to request HOA records, and warning signs of financial fraud. Marcus helped me set up a website to distribute the guide. Within 6 months, it had been downloaded over 50,000 times. I started getting thank you emails from people who'd successfully fought their HOAs using the information. The Nevada legislature even took notice. They passed a new law strengthening homeowner rights and requiring HOAs to carry errors and omissions insurance. The law was nicknamed the Fitzgerald Act, though I doubt Deborah appreciated the irony. A year after the initial incident, I was in my workshop when I got a visit from an unexpected source. A young woman in a business suit knocked on the open door. "Mr. Quincy, I'm Sarah Brennan from the Nevada Attorney General's office. Do you have a few minutes?" I invited her in, curious. The criminal case was long over. What could the AG's office want now? "We're expanding our HOA fraud investigation unit," Sarah explained. "We've discovered that the Sage Creek estate situation isn't unique. There are similar schemes operating in at least a dozen communities across the state. We're looking for someone with investigative experience to consult on the cases. Your background as a federal marshal, combined with your first-hand experience with HOA fraud, makes you an ideal candidate. You want me to help investigate other HOAs?" "Yes. Paid consultant position, flexible hours. You'd review financial records, help identify red flags, and potentially testify as an expert witness in criminal cases. We've got a budget for it and authorization to bring in outside expertise." I thought about it for about 10 seconds. "When do I start?" Over the next year, I helped investigate 15 HOA fraud cases. The patterns were remarkably similar. Board members with connections to vendors, inflated service contracts, aggressive enforcement actions to generate additional revenue, and obscure financial records to hide the theft. We got convictions in 12 cases. The other 3 were prosecuted civilly, resulting in settlements and removal of the corrupt board members. In total, we recovered over $3 million for Nevada homeowners. My workshop became my office on investigation days. I'd spread out financial records on my workbench, the same way I used to review case files in my Marshal days. The skills I'd developed tracking fugitives and building federal cases translated perfectly to following money trails and documenting fraud. The irony wasn't lost on me. Deborah Fitzgerald's attempt to seize my workshop had turned me into Nevada's go-to expert on HOA fraud. Her vindictive overreach had led to the prosecution of dozens of corrupt board members and the recovery of millions in stolen funds. 2 years after the initial incident, I got a letter. It was from the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California, where Deborah was serving her sentence. I almost threw it away, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten in tight, angry script. Deborah blamed me for everything: her conviction, her destroyed reputation, her family's financial problems, her imprisonment. She claimed she'd been trying to maintain community standards and that I'd turned a simple property dispute into a witch hunt. She insisted she'd done nothing wrong and that the jury had been biased against her. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of her actual crimes, no recognition that she'd stolen from her neighbors for years. Just anger and self-justification. I filed the letter with the rest of the case documents. Deborah Fitzgerald had spent so long believing she was entitled to control her neighbors that even federal prison couldn't shake that delusion. 3 years after the initial incident, I was profiled in Nevada magazine, "The Marshal Who Took Down HOA Fraud." The article covered the Sage Creek Estates case and my subsequent consulting work. It included interviews with Helen Garcia and other homeowners I'd helped, and it detailed the legislative changes that had resulted from the investigations. The article ended with a quote from me. "HOAs serve an important function when they're run properly, but any organization with power over people's homes and money needs oversight and accountability. Homeowners need to pay attention, ask questions, and not be afraid to fight back when that power is abused." I got calls after the article ran. More homeowners with problems, more HOAs needing investigation, and one particularly interesting call from a publisher asking if I'd be willing to write a book about HOA fraud. I'd never considered myself a writer, but I'd written thousands of reports and court documents over the years. How different could a book be? It took me a year to write the HOA Fraud Handbook, What Every Homeowner Needs to Know. Marcus helped with the legal sections, Patricia Reynolds contributed the financial fraud chapters, and I covered the investigation techniques and real-world cases. The book included the complete story of the Sage Creek Estates case with all the documentation that had been used in court. The book sold better than any of us expected. Apparently, a lot of people had HOA horror stories and were hungry for practical information about their rights. I did book signings, radio interviews, and even appeared on a couple of national morning shows. Deborah Fitzgerald was released after serving 3.5 years of her 4-year sentence. I heard through Helen that she'd moved to Arizona and was working as a retail manager. Her HOA career was permanently over, and her conviction meant she could never serve on a board again. Trevor Masterson was still in prison, serving his 5-year sentence. His property management company had dissolved, and several other HOAs had sued him civilly for fraud. He'd be paying restitution for the rest of his life. Richard Pemberton had been released after serving 2 years. He'd lost his accounting license and was working as a bookkeeper for a small business. From what I heard, he was genuinely remorseful and had cooperated fully with investigators to help prosecute other fraud cases. Susan Chen had been disbarred and served her 2-year sentence. The last I heard, she was working as a paralegal and trying to rebuild her life. Of all the defendants, she seemed to be the one who truly understood the magnitude of her mistakes. 5 years after the initial incident, I stood in my workshop holding a completed knife. It was a beautiful piece: Damascus steel blade, desert ironwood handle, brass pins, and spacers. It was commissioned by a federal judge as a retirement gift for a longtime Marshal. The inscription on the blade read, "Justice delayed is justice denied." It seemed appropriate. My workshop had become something more than just a place to practice my craft. It was the origin point of a movement that had changed how Nevada handled HOA fraud. It was where I'd built the case that sent Deborah Fitzgerald to prison. It was where I'd written the handbook that helped thousands of homeowners fight back against corrupt boards. And it was where I'd learned that retirement didn't mean the end of serving justice. It just meant finding new ways to do it. Helen Garcia stopped by that evening, as she often did. She'd served 3 years as HOA president, implementing reforms and rebuilding trust in the community. Now she was stepping down, confident that Sage Creek Estates was in good hands. "You know what the property values are in the neighborhood now?" she asked, sitting in my workshop with a glass of wine. Higher than when Deborah was in charge. 20% higher. Turns out people like living in communities where the HOA isn't corrupt and predatory. Who knew? We laughed. It had been a long road from that morning when I'd watched my tools being loaded onto a truck, but every step had been worth it. Are you going to keep doing the consulting work? Helen asked. As long as they need me. There are still plenty of corrupt HOAs out there, and most homeowners don't have the background to fight back effectively. If I can help, I should. The retired Marshal who became an HOA fraud expert. Not what you expected for retirement, I bet. No, I admitted, but I spent 32 years tracking down people who ran from justice. This isn't that different. Just different types of fugitives. The sun was setting over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. My workshop was exactly as it should be, full of tools, full of projects, full of possibility. And it was mine, on my property, protected by the law and by my determination to never let anyone take it again. Deborah Fitzgerald had tried to seize my workshop and sell my tools. She'd assumed I'd be like all the other homeowners she'd bullied over the years, too tired, too scared, or too uninformed to fight back. She was wrong, and that mistake had cost her everything. As for me, I was exactly where I wanted to be. In my workshop, doing work I loved, and knowing that I'd helped create a system where homeowners had the tools and knowledge to protect themselves. Sometimes justice takes time. Sometimes it requires patience, documentation, and the willingness to fight battles that seem unwinnable. But in the end, if you stand up for what's right and refuse to back down, justice has a way of prevailing. I learned that in 32 years as a federal marshal, and I proved it again in a quiet suburb of Henderson, Nevada, when an HOA board made the mistake of targeting the wrong person's workshop. The knife was finished. I wrapped it carefully and set it aside for shipping. Tomorrow I'd start on the next project. There was always another project, another case, another homeowner who needed help. But tonight, I'd sit in my workshop, enjoy the evening air, and appreciate the simple satisfaction of having stood my ground and won. Deborah Fitzgerald had tried to take my workshop. Instead, she'd given me a new purpose. I couldn't decide whether to thank her or pity her. In the end, I settled for feeling grateful. Grateful for my workshop, for my skills, for my stubborn refusal to accept injustice. Grateful for Helen and Marcus and Patricia and Frank and everyone who'd helped turn a personal violation into a movement for change. And grateful that when someone tried to take what was mine, I had the knowledge, the experience, and the proof to fight back and win. That was the real lesson of the whole experience: documentation, persistence, and the courage to stand up to bullies, no matter what authority they claimed to have. Those were the tools that mattered more than any saw or lathe or welding equipment. Those were the tools that Deborah Fitzgerald couldn't seize, couldn't sell, and couldn't take away. And those were the tools that had rebuilt my workshop, reclaimed my property, and helped protect thousands of other homeowners from the same fate. 5 years later, my workshop still stood exactly where it had always been, 15 feet inside my property line, on my 2-acre lot in Henderson, Nevada. And it would stay there, protected by law and by the knowledge that I'd fought for it, and won. Deborah Fitzgerald had learned a hard lesson about federal marshals. We don't forget. We don't forgive illegal actions, and we always have proof. The workshop was mine. It had always been mine, and no HOA board would ever take it away again.